I got a little bit of a flack for saying that France is a failed state in a previous video. But the fact of the matter is that I was actually too kind with the French state of affairs. You see, a country becomes a failed state usually because something happens to that country, and despite the best efforts of that said country, things continue to go wrong. But in the case of France, it is the democratically elected government that intentionally speeds up the process of destruction. That's worse than simply ending up being a failed state. Let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Now, at the beginning of this month, the French Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Housing and of Sustainable Habitat, no seriously, that's the full name of the ministry. Anyway, so these two ministries issued a joint statement about immigration in France. Now, the actual content of the statement is of smaller importance, though I will translate for you most of it. And the statement itself went almost completely unnoticed in the French press. But the text of it does mark a fundamental shift in the way the French authorities regard immigration. Le Figaro titles "The Statement That Denies the Concept of Illegal Immigration." Now let's read the entirety of the article. Quote, August 1, 2016, the Ministries of Interior and of Housing issued a statement that went completely unnoticed in the middle of the summer, but a statement that is of paramount importance on the changing attitudes of planning and the French political ideology. This text marks a shift in French conception of immigration. Until then, it was based on the distinction between legal immigration and illegal immigration. The first, in accordance with the law, was intended, for example, to accommodate workers which France may need, to trade students in the interests of France or the country of origin, or to ensure the principle of family unity. It was thought to be at about 200,000 people per year. In contrast, illegal immigrants who entered or remained were in breach of the law and thus absolutely had to return to their country voluntarily or by coercion. That was the principle. This difference, for the first time since immigration has become a political issue in the early 1980s, now seems denied entirely by the state. The irregular migrant has no reason to be returned in his or her country, but to be welcomed in France and supported by the state, just like a foreigner in a lawful situation or a French citizen that is in trouble. The statement of August 1, 2016 reads, quote, Created on February 25 at the initiative of Bernard Cazeneuve, Minister of the Interior, and Emmanuel Cosset, Minister of Housing and Sustainable Habitat, the Monitoring Committee of the Implementation Plan of Sheltering Homeless Migrants met again Tuesday, July 26, 2016. Chaired by Emmanuel Cosset, or COS, in the presence of representatives of the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Family, Children and Women's Rights, the session brought together 30 associations engaged in supporting migrants. Governments have paid tribute to their work and their mobilization to deal with this unprecedented migration crisis. On this occasion, the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Housing and Sustainable Habitat presented the Charter to Associations Operating Centers of Reception and Orientation, or CAD. Responding to a shared wish of the state and civil society actors, and having been drafted after several weeks of dialogue with CAD operators, the Charter lays down clear rules of operation and describes the main services provided to homeless migrants who are welcomed: home and localization requirements, staff ratios, restoration, assessment, legal, social and medical, of the situation of those admitted, and support and security, etc., etc. The CAD should enable migrant homeless people to enjoy a time of respite and engage, if they wish, into an asylum-seeking procedure. So if they don't want to get legal papers, that's fine. France will still support them. Now, isn't France great? Anyway, back to the communique, quote, It also allows them to have access to a supply of suitable care and to be directed quickly towards structures that match their situation, such as CADA for asylum seekers. Since 27th of October, probably last year, 148 reception and orientation centers were opened throughout the country for a total of nearly 2,000 spots, which have helped to protect more than 4,700 people in very tight situations, end quote. This press communique buries, in fact, any notion of illegal immigration. It abolishes the divide between legal and illegal immigration. It goes in the direction of the law of March 7, 2016, whose provisions are intended to make the application of expulsion measures very difficult. Maybe I should say the enforcement of expulsion measures. Anyway, it proclaims that France has a duty to welcome and support any foreigner on its territory, whether authorized to enter and reside on it or not. Humanitarian organizations, ideologues, and advocates of total freedom to immigrate have dreamed about this for at least 40 years. Mr. and Mrs. Kazanov-Kos offered them just that. The question is, what will be the magnitude of their appeal that this profound transformation of all the foundations of French immigration policy may eventually cause? The press release announces that France is opened, that it no longer sends its illegal migrants away, but rather welcomes them. The immigration potential is high. Hundreds of millions of impoverished and idle people in this world in turmoil think only of finding a welcoming point. The question is whether France, which has 5 million unemployed, massive housing problems, hundreds of thousands of people living below the poverty line, 1,000 sensitive urban zones, that would be Islamic no-go zones for those who don't follow the French newspeak, that are devastated by violence, exclusion, communitarianism, and radical Islamism. For all of these, the question is if France has the means to accommodate additional immigration. But for Mr. and Mrs. Kazanov-Kos, this is another matter, and it is clearly not their matter. I mean, what else am I supposed to say? And indeed, what else can be said at this point? I mean, when Hollande and the socialist administration were sworn into power, I was chatting with a French friend of mine, and I told him at the time that most Frenchmen will thoroughly regret having voted for that clown. Now, as the end of this nightmarish administration gets closer, history will have, of course, proven me correct, but it will also prove that I was generally optimistic. I mean, after all, I only expected some financial collapse, brain drain, capital drain, and maybe a few violent riots here and there. That's what I expected from a far-left administration. I most certainly, however, did not expect violent riots to happen daily, and by that I mean 10 per day. I most certainly did not expect to see major acts of Islamic terrorism several times a year in France, and surely did not expect to see the government going full Merkel and both de jure and de facto abolish any pretense that France is an actual country. I mean, after all, enforceable borders make the difference between a country and a territory that is up for grabs for whomever wants it. The bad news, however, is that voting for Front National won't make things better. I mean, FN's economic program is as disastrous as the socialists, and their social policies are just mildly better than those of the Sarkozy camp. I mean, at least the FN doesn't openly hate the French, which is of course great, but it is nowhere near enough to turn this thing around. I don't know. I guess we'll just have to wait and see, but the way things are going, one should save up in dollars, gold, platinum, non-EU real estate, or petrol if you have the chance, because the euro currency is in for a spectacular collapse. I mean, after all, the euro currency exists solely because France and Germany agree that the euro is great. But once France goes full Venezuela, and it will, that agreement won't be worth the paper it's written on. And the same will be true with the euro. Anyway, we'll talk more about economics when the data for the third quarter will be in. I suspect the markets won't be waiting for the next elections to deliver the well-deserved lessons for collectivists and socialists across Europe. But until then, Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon on Freedom Alternative.